The NRCS CPA 52 Environmental Evaluation Worksheet is used to document the outcomes of Phases 1 and 2 of the conservation planning process. In the course, two scenarios were presented to help familiarize you with the overall process and documentation requirements for the NRCS CPA 52. Let's review the NRCS CPA 52 for the last scenario, documenting the plan for Mr. Farmer's pasture land. In Section A, we see where Mr. and Mrs. Farmer's names were entered as the client. And in Section B, no conservation plan ID number was assigned, but EQUIP was noted as the program the client might be interested in. In Section C, the farm tract and field numbers were entered to identify the location where the proposed activities will occur. In Section D, the client's objectives were identified and listed. In this case, Mr. Farmer wants to be sure his livestock have enough water, and he wants to increase the amount and quality of forage produced on the farm so he doesn't have to buy hay and can increase his profitability. Over in Section E, the need for action was documented. There is a need for action because there is not always enough water for Mr. Farmer's livestock, and soil compaction and degraded plant productivity are limiting the amount of livestock forage on his pasture. In addition, stream bank erosion from the cattle having access to the stream has reduced water quality and fish habitat. Now we move down the form to Section F, Resource Concerns and Existing Benchmark Conditions. After walking the land with Mr. Farmer and making field notes, planning criteria obtained from the Field Office Technical Guide was consulted to identify resource concerns. Depending on the concern and related cause, planning criteria, screening levels, and assessment tools were used to identify resource concerns. Later on, when evaluating alternatives, the planning criteria was consulted again to see if the proposed alternatives would meet or not meet planning criteria. The benchmark condition for each resource concern that planning criteria says must be addressed was documented in Section F, along with other resource concerns Mr. Farmer talked about. Documentation reflected the assessment tools used in the planning process to identify benchmark conditions for each resource considered. In Section G, Special Environmental Concerns, benchmark conditions were also documented for each special environmental concern. Guide sheets and fact sheets contained within the form were consulted to identify which special environmental concerns had potential to be affected by the planned actions and to help document the benchmark conditions. Information contained in the Field Office Technical Guide was also used. Thorough documentation is important so that any reviewers will know everything that was considered. When a concern did not apply to the planning area, it was noted as such in the benchmark condition. Back up toward the top of the form in Section H, Alternatives, the alternatives, including the no action alternative, were recorded. Alternative 1 addressed Mr. Farmer's most immediate concerns, and Alternative 2 included conservation practices to address all the identified resource concerns. Both alternatives took human considerations into account. If you recall, Mr. Farmer had a limited amount of time, and this factor was considered when formulating alternatives. The check mark next to Alternative 2 indicates that this alternative meets the state criteria for a resource management system. In the following sections I and J, the alternatives were evaluated to determine how the recommended practices would affect benchmark conditions of the resource concerns and special environmental concerns. To do this, assessment tools were revisited when applicable, and the CPPE and network effects diagrams were also consulted. After the effects were determined in Section I, Effects of Alternatives, planning criteria was consulted to see if the alternatives meet or do not meet the planning criteria threshold for a resource concern. A check was placed in the Not Meet PC box to identify the resource concerns that do not meet planning criteria. Once again, thorough documentation indicates that the impact on each resource and special environmental concern was considered and that NRCS complied with the requirements of laws, regulations, and executive orders, as well as its own policy. For each special environmental concern, There's a statement to indicate if the alternative may affect or has no effect on the benchmark condition, and the reasons for the choice was documented. In Section K, Other Agencies and Broad Public Concerns, alternatives were further evaluated for any necessary easements, permissions, or permits that would be needed. Additionally, the cumulative effects of each alternative were considered. This required thinking about the impacts, not only of the planned actions, but also the incremental impacts that other past, present, and foreseeable future actions are likely to have on the same resources. In Section L, mitigation measures were documented that were not explicitly included in the alternative and would be needed to offset any foreseeable adverse impacts. In Section M, Preferred Alternative, the client selects an alternative. In our case, Mr. Farmer decided which actions he will be taking on his land. Mr. Farmer selected Alternative 1, and the rationale for his decision was documented. Moving down to Section N, Context, we see the contexts that were used to evaluate the significance of the alternatives. Here, the significance of the action was analyzed in the context of the farm, the county, and the hydrologic unit. In Section O, Determination of Significance or Extraordinary Circumstances, the preferred alternative selected by Mr. Farmer underwent additional evaluation. The planned action was evaluated using the significance factors to determine whether an action would have extraordinary circumstances and potential for significant impacts on the quality of the human environment. To help make these determinations, the impacts of the special environmental concerns recorded in Section J were referenced. In our example, the determination in Section O was documented with a no response for each of the questions. The absence of any extraordinary circumstances means that the actions can proceed without the preparation of an environmental assessment as long as the planned actions are all covered by categorical exclusions or the action is tiered to an existing NRCS NEPA document. However, if any of the questions in Section O have been answered yes, then the State Environmental Liaison would have to be contacted to help determine whether a site-specific NEPA analysis might be required. In Section P, the individual completing Parts A through O of the NRCS CPA 52 must sign and date to indicate they have used the best available information. This may or may not be an agency representative. In cases where the planner is not an NRCS employee, they must sign in the first signature area, and then the NRCS employee will sign in the second signature area to confirm and validate the information on behalf of NRCS. When NRCS plans on behalf of another agency, NRCS need only sign as the planner, and then the lead agency RFO will complete the rest of the NRCS CPA 52. In the NRCS CPA 52 prepared for Mr. Farmer, the remaining sections were completed by the NRCS Responsible Federal Official, or RFO. The RFO documented Section Q, NEPA Compliance Finding, and Section R, Rationale Supporting the Finding, concluding with their signature in Section S. Before documenting the categorical exclusion that applies in this case, the RFO reread Section 610.46 of the National Environmental Compliance Handbook. This section provides a list of all NRCS categorical exclusions, as well as more detailed considerations and requirements for their use. Remember, thorough and complete documentation in the NRCS CPA 52 reflects the NRCS conservation planning process and NRCS's compliance with all environmental laws and other requirements for the protection of the environment. Be sure to document your work so that others, like the RFO or another federal agency, can move forward with their evaluation and findings. Thank you for your time in this course.